The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Jennie Slater read it 3 times before her legs gave out beneath her. She sat in the dirt of her own front porch, the paper trembling in her hands, the noon sun hammering down on the parched Texas earth of Caldwell County, and she read it a 4th time because she could not make the words chain no matter how desperately she needed them to. 60 days. The bank in Abilene was giving her 60 days to produce $240 in back payments, or the Slater land, all 412 acres of it, the land her husband Thomas had broken his back over for 11 years, the land where she had buried him just 4 months prior under the old elm at the east fence line, would be seized and sold at public auction. 60 days. It was the end of April, 1881. The summer heat was already threatening. Her cattle herd numbered just under 40 head after the hard winter had taken the rest. Her ranch hand, old Pete Grady, was 63 years old and moved like a man who'd been stepped on by horses, which he had been repeatedly. She had no money saved because Thomas had borrowed heavily to survive the drought of 1879, and the bank had been patient until it suddenly was not. She was 31 years old, a widow with calloused hands and a broken heart, and she had exactly 1 growing season to save everything she had ever known. She did not hear Marcus Keller's horse approaching until the animal stopped at her gate, and its rider looked down at her sitting in the dust with something shifting behind his dark eyes that she could not yet name. "Mrs. Slater," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't carry unnecessary weight. He was 36 years old, lean and weathered, with jaw-length dark hair pushed back beneath a flat-brimmed hat and eyes the color of creek water under overcast sky. His ranch, the Keller spread, bordered her eastern fence for nearly 2 miles. They had been neighbors for 4 years without ever being anything more than polite to one another across that fence. "Mr. Keller," she said, and did not move from the dirt because her legs still were not cooperative. He swung down from his horse in one practiced motion, tied the animal to her gate post, and walked toward her with a measured, careful step, like a man approaching something that might shatter. He crouched down in front of her so they were at eye level, and he looked at the letter still clenched in her hands. "Bank?" he asked. She nodded. She was not going to cry in front of Marcus Keller. She had made that decision in the same moment her legs had failed her, and she was going to honor it. "How long?" 60 days, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Behind them, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something whispering a warning. His eyes held hers with a steadiness that was, in that particular terrible moment, the most frightening thing she had ever encountered, because it suggested he was already calculating something she hadn't yet thought to calculate. "Then we have 60 days, Marcus Keller said simply, and nothing in Jennie Slater's life was ever quite the same after that. She had met Thomas Slater at a church social in Wichita when she was 19, and she had loved him with the whole uncomplicated heart of a young woman who had never been taught to be cautious. Thomas was good-natured and ambitious and not particularly skilled at ranching, but he tried hard, and trying hard had been enough for a long time. He had staked their claim in Caldwell County in 1870, and they had worked the land together through good years and punishing ones, through 3 miscarriages and the loss of their first son to fever at the age of 2, and through the slow grinding erosion of the Texas drought that had taken cattle and savings, and some small portion of hope from nearly every family in the county. Thomas had died of a heart seizure in December, dropping in the barn while feeding the horses, and Jennie had found him in the evening cold and known immediately, with a terrible clarity, that a vast and unknowable portion of her life had simply ended. She had grieved. She had handled the burial and the paperwork and the condolences and the casseroles from the women of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell. She had made herself eat and sleep and maintain the ranch through January and February, because the cattle still needed feeding regardless of her interior landscape, and because she was not the kind of woman who surrendered to circumstances without at least attempting a fight. But the bank letter in late April was a different kind of blow. It was the kind that didn't announce itself with grief's honest weight. It arrived with calculation and deadline, and it was, Jennie recognized, a trap she hadn't known she was already walking into. Marcus Keller had come to pay his respects when Thomas died, and she had seen him at the graveside service, standing slightly apart from the other neighbors in the cold December light, his hat in his hands. He had not offered hollow comfort. He had simply said, "If you need anything at all, Mrs. Slater, send word." She had thanked him and filed it away as the kind of thing neighbors said in bereavement situations and did not necessarily mean. He had meant it. On the day he found her in the dust of her porch, he came inside and sat across from her at the kitchen table while she made coffee, because making coffee was something practical she could do, and he studied the bank letter and the accounts book she had kept meticulously, and her list of assets with the focused attention of a man who took problems seriously. "You've got 37 head that survived the winter," he said. 38. One of the heifers calved last week. Beef prices in Abilene are running around $4 a head at the yards right now. Even if you drove the whole herd, you'd be short. "I know," she said. She poured the coffee and set his cup in front of him and sat down. "But if I drive the whole herd, I've got nothing left to work with for next season." He nodded. "So you can't liquidate your way out of this." "No." He turned a page of her accounts book and studied something. "You've got the south pasture sitting fallow. Thomas was going to plant winter wheat last fall, but then she stopped. It didn't happen." "Spring wheat," Marcus said. "You can still put in a crop, it's early enough." Prices at the grain elevator in Caldwell have been strong. A good yield on the south pasture, combined with driving maybe 15 head to market midsummer, and you might be able to make the 240. Jennie looked at him. She had been running the numbers in her head for 3 days and had arrived at something close to the same conclusion, but hearing it laid out plainly by another person made it feel simultaneously more possible and more terrifying. "The seed alone would cost me $30 I don't have," she said. Marcus closed the accounts book. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at her over the rim of it with those steady gray-blue eyes. "I have seed," he said. "I've got a surplus from what I put in on my north field. I've got 2 extra hands who aren't fully occupied until summer roundup, and I've got a 4-bottom plow that can turn your south pasture in half the time your equipment can." The silence in the kitchen stretched out and became something almost tangible. "Mr. Keller," Jennie said carefully, "I appreciate your neighborly concern, but I cannot take charity." Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile. "I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Slater. I'm offering a business arrangement. You let me run 20 head of my cattle on your north pasture through the summer. I'm short on grass this year. My east range dried up hard, and in return, I provide seed, labor, and equipment for your wheat crop. We settle up in the fall." She studied him. He was watching her with a patience that seemed genuine rather than strategic, though she wasn't yet certain she could tell the difference. She had heard things about Marcus Keller over the years in the loose, unverified way one hears things about neighbors in rural communities. That he'd come from somewhere back east, perhaps Ohio or Pennsylvania. That he'd had a wife who died young before he came to Texas. That he was a fair dealer but kept to himself. That he worked his land with a quiet, relentless competence that had earned him a reputation as a serious man without quite earning him any close friendships. She didn't know which parts of any of that were true. But she looked at his offer and turned it over and found that it was, in fact, structured as a fair exchange rather than a gift, and that made it something she could accept without surrendering too much of the pride that had been holding her upright for 4 months. "We put it in writing," she said. "Of course," he agreed immediately, and that was how it began. The seed went in during the first week of May, which was later than ideal but within the workable window for spring wheat in that part of Texas. Marcus's 2 ranch hands, a young man named Cord who was barely 20 and a quiet Mexican vaquero called Esteban, who was perhaps 40 and spoke little, but worked with magnificent efficiency, came over with the 4-bottom plow and turned the south pasture in 2 long, hard days. Jennie worked alongside them, refusing to stand back and supervise, pulling rocks from the turned earth with her bare hands until her palms were raw. Marcus came himself on the third day with the seed wheat in burlap sacks loaded on a wagon, and he and Jennie walked the rows together to check the soil moisture while Cord and Esteban managed the seeding. "You know wheat farming?" she asked him. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," he said. "My father grew wheat. I know it well enough." "What brought you to cattle ranching in Texas?" He was quiet for a moment, studying the turned earth. The afternoon light was long and golden across the pasture, and somewhere at the far fence line, a meadowlark was conducting an absurdly cheerful argument with the wind. "Change," he said finally. "I needed something different." She didn't push further because she recognized the tone of a person who had put a careful boundary around something painful, and she had no desire to be the kind of person who pressed against that kind of boundary. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that neither of them had planned or particularly prepared for. Marcus came to the Slater ranch every other morning to check on the wheat's progress, to manage his 20 head of cattle on her north pasture, and almost without either of them noticing it happening, to help with whatever else needed doing. He mended 2 sections of fence that were on the verge of catastrophic failure. He helped Pete Grady when Pete's bad hip made certain tasks impossible. He brought tools she didn't have and didn't charge her for their use. Jennie, for her part, was deeply uncomfortable with this. The business arrangement had been clear and bounded. The additional help felt like it was dissolving those boundaries, and she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or suspicious of the dissolution. She was both, simultaneously, for a considerable time. "You don't have to come every other day," she told him in the second week of May, when he arrived to find her balanced on the roof of the barn, attempting to replace a section of shingles that had blown off in a spring storm. "Get down from there," he said, "before I have to explain to Pete Grady how his employer ended up dead. I have been on this roof before, Mr. Keller. Come down and let me do it. I'm taller. That's not actually a relevant qualification for roof work. Come down anyway." She came down, not because he told her to, but because one of the remaining shingles chose that moment to slide beneath her boot, and she very nearly went over the edge, and the terror in her chest when she caught herself on the ridge beam was something she preferred not to experience again with an audience. He went up the ladder with a bucket of shingles and nails and did the job with a competence that was genuinely irritating, and when he came back down, she handed him a cup of water without looking directly at him. "Thank you," she said. He said, and drank the water. They stood in the afternoon light in the packed dirt yard of the barn, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and in that silence Jennie became aware, with the abruptness of something you've been not noticing for some time finally demanding acknowledgement, that Marcus Keller was looking at her with something in his expression that was considerably more layered than neighborly concern. She looked away first. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she would be ready for that for a very long time, but she filed it away, carefully, in the part of herself that was still taking inventory of what remained. Late May brought a strong thunderstorm that terrified the cattle and knocked down 2 sections of the fence between her property and Marcus's eastern border. By the time the storm passed at midnight, Jennie was out in the mud and lightning afterglow with a lantern, trying to locate where her cattle had mixed with his, and she found Marcus already there with his own lantern, sorting animals by ear mark in the dark, with a calmness that she found both admirable and slightly unnerving. "How did you get here so fast?" she demanded, water running from the brim of her hat. "I was already on my way to check the fence," he said. "I knew the storm would test it." He caught one of her steers by the ear, checked the mark, guided it back through the temporary gap toward her pasture. "You're missing 2 head. I know, they went east toward the creek. I'll find them. I'll come with you." He stopped and looked at her in the lantern light. She was soaked to the skin, her dark hair plastered against her neck, her boots making sounds in the mud like small surrenders. He opened his mouth as though he was going to tell her to go back inside, and then he clearly thought better of it. "Bring the lantern," he said. They found the two missing cattle in a gully near the creek, huddled together in the kind of bovine distress that was pitiable if you hadn't been roused from bed at midnight to address it. Getting them out of the gully required a great deal of rope and persuasion, and resulted in both Jennie and Marcus being thoroughly covered in creek mud from boots to elbows. On the walk back, leading the recovered cattle, she slipped on a wet rock and he caught her arm before she went down, and the grip of his hand on her arm was steady and sure, and warm even through the wet fabric of her sleeve, and he held on a moment longer than was strictly necessary for balance purposes, and she did not pull away, and both of them were very carefully not looking at each other. "Mud agrees with you," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of something she could only identify as careful humor. "Mr. Keller," she said, "do not start. Just an observation. Keep your observations to yourself." But she was smiling into the dark, and she thought perhaps he knew it, and that was more dangerous than the creek water and the mud and the lost cattle put together. June arrived with a heat that settled over Caldwell County like a flat iron, and the wheat came up green and stubborn and beautiful in her south pasture, and Jennie walked the rows every morning at first light and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, hope that wasn't entirely desperate. The hope frightened her almost as much as the despair had. She began to see Marcus Keller more clearly in June, the way you begin to see something that's been present in your peripheral vision for a while once you finally turn to face it. He was not a man who talked much for the sake of filling silence, but when he did speak, it mattered. He was precise and observant and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny in a dry way that snuck up on her and made her laugh before she decided whether she wanted to. He was, she noticed, unfailingly kind to Pete Grady without ever condescending to the old man's limitations, which told her something real about his character. He was also, she noticed, occasionally haunted by something he kept very carefully in the interior of himself. She caught it sometimes in unguarded moments, when he stood at the fence looking west at the distant hills with his coffee going cold in his hand, or when he thought she wasn't looking and something shifted in his face like clouds crossing the sun. She knew grief by intimate familiarity, and what she saw in those moments was shaped like grief, though she couldn't tell its specific origin. One evening in the second week of June, he stayed later than usual, helping her and Pete rehang a gate that had warped beyond function, and when Pete went inside, she and Marcus sat on the porch steps as the day's heat softened toward something bearable, and the sky put on the kind of performance it only managed in Texas summers, great sweeping colors from gold to coral to deep violet at the horizon. "You've never remarried," she said. She hadn't intended to say it. It arrived without advance notice. He looked at the sky. "No. How long has it been since your wife?" A pause. 8 years. She died in 1873. Her name was Clara. "I'm sorry." "So am I," he said, and the simplicity of it had a weight behind it that she recognized as the compressed weight of a great deal of pain that had been lived with long enough to become quiet. "What was she like?" Jennie asked. She wasn't sure why she was asking, perhaps because she understood the need to have someone say the name of the person you'd lost in a way that acknowledged their reality. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and in the gathering dark his profile was still and careful. "She was kind," he said. "Genuinely kind. It wasn't something she performed. She was also brave and impatient, and she laughed too loud for polite company." Something moved in his voice that was almost tenderness. "She died of a fever. There was nothing anyone could do, and knowing that never actually helped." Jennie nodded. She understood that specifically the uselessness of facts as consolation. "Is that why you came to Texas?" she asked. "To get away from the grief?" "Partially," he said. "Also because I needed to be somewhere where the work was so demanding I didn't have time to stop and think too much. It was a reasonable strategy for a while." And then he looked at her. In the last of the light, his eyes were very direct and very open in a way that she hadn't seen before, as though the early dark had given him permission to be slightly less contained than usual. "And then it became simply where I lived," he said, "and I stopped running from it and started just living inside it, which is, I think, the only real alternative. Jennie thought of Thomas, of the way grief had ambushed her in the most ordinary moments, reaching for a coffee cup and grabbing the wrong one, the one that had been his, the chipped blue one. Of how living inside it was indeed the only option, and also, on many days, the most demanding thing she had ever done. "Yes," she said quietly. The dark had settled around them completely now, and the stars had come out in their extravagant Texas multitude, and the night insects were beginning their various negotiations with the darkness. She should go inside. Pete had already retired. She had no reason to continue sitting here with this man who was her neighbor, and she was becoming increasingly unable to pretend otherwise, something that was beginning to feel like considerably more than her neighbor. She went inside. But she thought about the conversation for 3 days afterward, and what she thought about most particularly was the way he had looked at her in the last light with his face open and unguarded, and what she had seen in that openness, and whether she was ready to trust what she thought she'd seen. She was not sure she was ready. She was also not sure she had the option of continuing to pretend she wasn't seeing it. The crisis arrived in the 3rd week of June, and it arrived with the specific ugliness of something that has been approaching for a long time and finally stops being willing to wait. His name was Douglas Halloran, and he was the president of the First Caldwell Bank, a man of approximately 50, with a pale, soft face that had never seen agricultural labor, and a manner that combined false friendliness with the particular confidence of a man who held other people's desperation as a negotiating advantage. He arrived at Jennie's door on a Tuesday afternoon in a buggy with a man she didn't recognize sitting beside him, a younger man in a town suit who watched everything with noting eyes. "Mrs. Slater," Halloran said, with the practiced warmth of a man who had delivered bad news often enough to have developed a technique for it. "I hope I find you well. This is Mr. Patterson. He represents the Southwestern Land Development Corporation out of Fort Worth." Jennie stood in her doorway and felt the trap closing before Halloran had spoken another word. She had been in enough difficult negotiations over the years to recognize the architecture of one. "Mr. Halloran," she said. "Mr. Patterson." "What can I do for you? May we come in?" "I think we'll talk here," she said. Halloran's warmth flickered almost imperceptibly. He continued, his tone unchanged, explaining that the Southwestern Land Development Corporation had expressed interest in acquiring several properties in Caldwell County as part of a larger development initiative. That they were prepared to offer fair market value. He named a figure for her land that was, she had to admit, reasonable on paper. That this would, of course, resolve her current obligation to the bank with considerable surplus remaining. He framed it as a gift. He framed it as an opportunity. He framed it as the kind of outcome that a practical woman in her situation would find difficult to refuse. "And when exactly," Jennie said, "did you communicate my financial situation to Mr. Patterson's corporation?" Halloran's warmth flickered again, more substantially. "Banking relationships are naturally part of that. Information is private," she said. "Mrs. Slater, I assure you, I would like you both to leave my property," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She had learned, in the months since Thomas died, to make her voice level regardless of what was happening beneath it. "I'm not selling. I have a season's crop in the south pasture, and I will make my payment by the deadline. If I do not, the bank may proceed as the loan agreement specifies. I will not be pressured outside those terms." Patterson spoke for the first time. He had a smooth Fort Worth voice and the eyes of a man who assessed everything in terms of its yield. "Mrs. Slater, I understand you're emotionally attached to the property, but you're a woman alone. She's not alone." The voice came from behind them, and Jennie looked past the 2 men in her yard to find Marcus Keller on his horse at the gate, having arrived so quietly that none of them had heard him. He dismounted and came through the gate with an unhurried ease that somehow communicated absolute and immovable authority. He came to stand at Jennie's left side, not in front of her, not taking her position, but exactly beside her, and looked at Halloran and Patterson with an expression of relaxed, total inflexibility. "Keller," Halloran said. His tone had changed. He knew Marcus clearly, and what he knew had produced a wariness that the blank-faced Patterson didn't share yet. "Her crop is looking very healthy," Marcus said conversationally. "Wheat prices are strong. I expect she'll make her payment well before the deadline." He paused. "You should both enjoy the drive back into town." The dismissal was so complete and so politely delivered that there was almost nothing Patterson or Halloran could do with it. After a moment of stillness in which Halloran clearly decided this particular approach was not going to yield results today, he tipped his hat to Jennie with the ingratiating smoothness of a man who fully intended to try again, and the two of them got back in the buggy and turned it around. Jennie watched them go. She was shaking slightly beneath her calm exterior, and she despised the shaking. Marcus stood beside her until the buggy was out of sight, then looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "How did you know to come?" "Pete sent word. He saw Halloran's buggy from the pasture and came to find me." She made a note to find something very good to do for Pete Grady at the earliest opportunity. "Halloran shared my account information with that land corporation," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "He's done it with 3 other families in the county already. Larson family, the Mendozas, the Perkins family. He finds people who are behind on payments and brings the corporation in to buy. The bank gets the bad loan off its books, the corporation gets the land below value. Halloran presumably gets something for his trouble." Jennie turned to look at him fully. "You knew this was happening. I found out last week. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you without frightening you unnecessarily." The anger that moved through her was sharp and not entirely directed at Halloran. "Marcus," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without premeditation. "Don't manage what I know about things that affect me. I am not a person who needs protecting from information." He held her gaze. He didn't flinch from the anger, which she respected. "You're right," he said. "I apologize." She looked at him for a moment longer. The anger ebbed. She was aware that the apology had been genuine and direct and without qualification, which was rarer than it should have been among men of her acquaintance. "What do we do about Halloran?" she asked. "There's a lawyer in Abilene named Hartwell who has been building a case against the bank's practices for 6 months. 3 of the families affected have already spoken to him. I was going to suggest you do the same." "You've been managing this," she said, not as an accusation but as a realization. Something uncertain moved in his face. "I've been paying attention," he said carefully, "to what affects this part of the county, to what affects you." There it was. As open as it was going to get for now. Jennie was quiet for a moment, looking at the dust the buggy had left in the road. "Thank you," she said, "for coming today." "Of course," he said, and his voice had something careful in it that suggested he was deliberately not saying more than that, and she appreciated the carefulness even while some part of her was aware of how much more there was on the other side of it. She went to Abilene the following week and spoke to Hartwell, who was a methodical man with a file cabinet that was a testament to the range of Halloran's misconduct. She signed the affidavit he prepared. She was not the only woman in that file cabinet. The knowledge of that made her angry in a productive direction, which was far better than the paralyzed anger that served no one. On the way home from Abilene, Marcus driving the wagon because he had insisted on accompanying her, and she had, after very minimal protest, allowed it, she sat beside him on the wagon bench in the afternoon heat and watched the landscape unspool the flat, dry grass, the distant blue smudge of hills, the enormous Texas sky, and felt something shift inside herself. "Tell me something about Ohio," she said. He looked at her with mild surprise at the non sequitur, then something relaxed in his face. "It's green," he said, "very green in a way that Texas isn't. Everything here is beautiful in a different way. It's a bigger, harder kind of beautiful, but Ohio has a softness to it that I still miss sometimes. Do you ever think about going back?" "No," he said, and the certainty of it was immediate. "This is my home." She looked at the road ahead. "I was born in Missouri," she said. I thought Kansas was home when Thomas and I married. Then Texas became home and I stopped thinking about Missouri at all. I can't imagine leaving this land now. It's not, she searched for the right word. It's not just sentiment, it's more than that. It's 400 acres that two people work themselves half to death over, and the ground has their effort in it, and I feel that when I walk on it. I feel Thomas in it. I can't just hand that to a land corporation. Marcus was quiet, and she was afraid she'd said too much, revealed too much of the specific geography of her grief, but when she glanced at him, his expression was not uncomfortable. It was, if anything, deeply attentive. "No," he said. "You can't, and you're not going to." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure when she had started believing Marcus Keller automatically, but she was aware that she had. July was the month when everything between them became both better and more complicated, which is perhaps the defining characteristic of love under pressure. The wheat grew through June and into July with the obliging stubbornness of a good crop in adequate conditions. And the day she walked the south pasture with Marcus in the second week of July and looked at the stalks filling out toward harvest was one of the better days she could remember in a very long time. The grain elevator in Caldwell was offering good prices. Her preliminary numbers, calculated and recalculated at the kitchen table 3 nights running, suggested that between the wheat crop and the 15 head of cattle she planned to drive to Abilene in late August, she might clear not just the $240 but a modest surplus. This was not a certainty. The weather had to hold. She needed a good yield from the harvest, but it was real possibility rather than desperate optimism, and the difference mattered enormously. She told Marcus on that walk through the wheat, and she watched something genuine and uncomplicated move across his face, something that was simply, cleanly, gladness for her. And that particular expression was so undefended that it caught her off guard, and she felt something move in the center of her chest that she had been carefully not feeling for several weeks. "You did this," he said. "This was your land and your work and your refusal to quit. And your seed and your plow and your hands and cord and Esteban," she pointed out. "Those were secondary contributions. Marcus," she stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood in the July heat with the wheat on either side of them and the sky enormous and bright above them. "Why are you doing all of this? Genuinely. What is it that brings you here every other day? What made you come to my door that day in April when I was sitting in the dirt reading that letter?" He looked at her steadily, and she could see him deciding something. She could see the decision being made behind his eyes. "I came because I saw you sitting in the dirt and something in me refused to keep riding," he said. "As for why I keep coming back, Jennie, I think you know the answer to that." She held his gaze. The wheat moved slightly in the warm air around them. "I'm not ready," she said. The honesty of it was abrupt, almost startling in its clarity. "I know," he said without any trace of hurt or pressure. "I'm not asking you to be. Thomas has been gone 4 months. I'm still," she stopped. "I still reach for his coffee cup sometimes, the blue one. I still turn to tell him things." "I know," Marcus said again, and this time the simplicity of it held the weight of a man who understood exactly that particular grief from his own interior experience. "I'm telling you this because I think you deserve honesty rather than pretending I don't notice that." She made a small, helpless gesture with her hands. "That there's something here between us," he supplied quietly. "Yes," he nodded. "I appreciate the honesty. I'll wait as long as you need." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Marcus, please don't make promises like that and then be sorry you made them." He almost smiled. "That's a reasonable concern," he said, "but I mean it." She believed him. God help her, she believed him. They walked back through the wheat together, and the afternoon heat pressed down on them with the impartial intensity of a Texas July. And she was aware of walking next to him with the full length of her attention in a way she had been carefully not doing before. And it was terrifying, and also, beneath the terror, something that she recognized with a startled recognition as warmth. The cattle drive to Abilene was planned for the last week of August, 15 head, and Marcus made it clear from the outset that he was coming. It's a 4-day drive minimum, Jennie said. You have your own ranch to manage. Cord and Esteban can manage it for a week, Marcus said. Pete can't do a cattle drive. I can hire a drover. I've already offered to go. She crossed her arms and looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who is losing an argument and knows it and is not entirely displeased about this. You are extremely difficult to refuse. I've been told, he said pleasantly. The wheat harvest came first in the second week of August, and it was, by God, a good one. Not an extraordinary yield, but solid and honest. And the grain elevator in Caldwell paid 11 cents a bushel, which was better than she dared hope. And when she walked out of the elevator with money in her hand, she stood on the wooden sidewalk of Caldwell's Main Street and simply breathed for a moment. Marcus was standing next to her. She looked at him sideways. He looked back. She laughed. It was involuntary and abrupt and felt in the Texas August heat like something breaking loose from a long confinement, and she put her hand over her mouth too late to contain it. He grinned at her, and it was the first real, unguarded grin she'd seen from him, and it changed his whole face into something younger and warmer and so immediately appealing that she felt her heart make a small and reckless movement in her chest. "Don't say I told you so," she warned. "I wasn't going to. You were thinking it." "I was thinking," he said, "that you're remarkable. But I can keep that to myself if you prefer." She did not prefer. She kept that thought to herself. The cattle drive south toward Abilene began on a Monday morning in the last week of August, Jennie and Marcus and Pete handling the 15 head through the long dry grass with the kind of coordinated effort that required very little discussion between people who had spent 4 months learning how the other one worked. Pete managed the point cattle. Marcus rode flank. Jennie kept the drag and didn't complain about the dust. The first night they camped on the open range under a sky so thick with stars it looked structural, like it was holding something up. Pete turned in early, his hip making its usual complaints, and Jennie and Marcus sat at the campfire across from each other in the firelight, drinking coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and talked for 2 hours about things they had not previously found occasion to discuss. She told him about Missouri, about her mother who had grown herbs and kept a kitchen garden, and was the most pragmatically capable woman Jennie had ever known. He told her about his father's Ohio farm, and a childhood largely spent outdoors in a way that had made indoor life always feel slightly provisional to him. She told him about the early years with Thomas in Kansas, the good years before the drought hardened everything, and she found she could speak of Thomas with an affection that wasn't freighted with the immediate crushing weight it had carried 4 months ago. The grief was still real. It was simply more integrated, less an emergency and more a permanent landscape feature. Marcus listened to her talk about Thomas with the specific careful attention of someone who understood that being willing to listen to a woman talk about the man she had loved was a form of respect for her whole self, not just the convenient parts. "You were happy," he said. "Not a question exactly." "Yes," she said. "In the ways that matter, he was a good man, not always a practical one, but good to his bones. That counts for a great deal." "It counts for everything," she said, and then, looking at the fire, "Is it strange to hear me talk about him?" "No," Marcus said. "He was part of your life, he still is. That's not something I would want you to feel you need to conceal." She looked at him across the fire. The light moved across the planes of his face and made him look both older and somehow more nakedly honest than usual. "Marcus," she said, "tell me about Clara." He was quiet for a moment. Then he talked, slowly at first and then with more ease, about a woman who had been impatient and funny and deeply kind, who had wanted children and never had the chance, who had been sick for 3 weeks before the fever took her, and who had in those last days made him promise to eventually stop being sad, which was, he said with the ghost of that grin, an extraordinarily difficult promise to keep. "She made you promise that," Jennie said. "Specifically, she made me repeat it. She was very thorough." "Have you kept it?" He looked at the fire. "I'm working on it," he said, "more successfully lately than before." She understood what he was saying. She let it sit between them in the firelight without responding directly, because they were both still finding their way through the territory between grief and whatever came after it. And the territory was not simple, and neither of them was in a hurry. But when it was time to sleep, and she rolled herself into her blanket on one side of the banked fire, and he settled on the other, she lay awake for a while looking at the stars and thinking about a woman named Clara who had made a dying promise, and a man who had carried it for 8 years. And something in the geometry of it made her heart feel very full and very careful, the way you feel when you're carrying something you don't want to spill. The cattle reached the Abilene yards on Thursday afternoon and sold at $4.20 a head, which was better than Marcus's April estimate. And after the broker's commission, Jennie had $62 in her hand that she added to the wheat money in her account book and arrived at a total that was, by a margin of $37, more than enough to meet the bank payment. She paid it the following morning at the bank in Abilene, making sure to do so across the counter from the most senior clerk available, who was not Halloran, who was not present, which was convenient because she had things she would have liked to say to Douglas Halloran, and she was not yet certain she could say them in the contained manner of a woman who had already spoken to a lawyer. She got the receipt. She put it in her dress pocket and placed her hand over it and pressed it flat, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk of Abilene for a moment in the September morning sunshine and felt the specific, extraordinary relief of a person who has been running toward a cliff edge for months and has finally, definitively stopped. Marcus came out of the bank behind her and stood beside her, and she looked up at him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She turned to face him fully and felt completely, totally overwhelmed for approximately 3 seconds, which she addressed by pressing her lips together very firmly and breathing through her nose until the overwhelming passed. "Thank you," she said when she trusted her voice. "I cannot possibly say all of it in one word, but thank you for April, for all of it." "Jennie," he said quietly, "I mean it. You came when you didn't have to. You stayed when you didn't have to. You never once made me feel like—" She stopped. "You never once made me feel reduced, like a woman who needed rescuing. You made me feel like a partner in something. And I need you to know that I know the difference, and that it matters more than I can adequately express." His expression in that moment was very open and very still, like a landscape after a storm when everything is washed clean and freshly visible. "You did the work," he said. "Every day of it." "We did the work," she said. They stood on the sidewalk of Abilene in the September sunshine, and a wagon rolled past on the street, and a man in a store across the way was pulling down a shade against the morning light, and the world continued its ordinary business around them while something extraordinary arranged itself in the space between two people. Jennie Slater took a breath. She had been not ready in July when he'd said the words out loud in the wheat field, and that had been honest and right. But September was not July, and something had changed in the months in between, and she was aware with a clarity that was slightly unnerving in its certainty that she was telling herself she was not ready, partly out of habit and partly out of fear, and neither of those was the same thing as actually not being ready. "When we get home," she said, "would you like to come to dinner? Not in a neighborly capacity, specifically not in a neighborly capacity." Something happened in his face that was so immediate and so unguarded that she felt it in her own chest. "Yes," he said, "I would." "Good," she said, in the voice of a woman who has made a decision and intends to stand by it, and turned to walk toward the livery stable, and if she was smiling broadly enough that a passing woman in a bonnet gave her a puzzled look, she did not particularly mind. They drove the wagon home through the September afternoon with Pete dozing in the back and the light going gold and long across the dry grass. And they did not need to talk much because something had already been said, clearly enough that words were almost decorative, and the space between them on the wagon bench was comfortable in the particular way of a space that has already decided what it is. The dinner was on a Saturday, 6 days after Abilene. Jennie spent considerably more time than she intended to spend thinking about it, and she made pot roast with the last of the carrots from her kitchen garden and corn bread from the cornmeal she'd bought in town. And she changed her dress twice before arriving at a gray wool that was her best and most presentable without constituting an announcement. Marcus arrived at 7 o'clock with the precision of a man who has thought carefully about timing, and he had made his own efforts toward presentation. Freshly shaved, clean shirt, hair combed, which made him look younger and more formal and slightly uncertain in a way that she found endearing and also privately reassuring, because she was also slightly uncertain, and it was good not to be alone in that. Pete, displaying the social intelligence of a man who had been watching a developing situation for several months with the patience of a chess player, announced after dinner that his hip was troubling him and he'd be going to bed early, and Jennie thanked him with a look that conveyed full awareness of what he was doing, and Pete went to bed with an expression of serene innocence. She and Marcus sat on the porch in the September dark with coffee, and the night air had a first tentative coolness in it that announced the eventual possibility of autumn, and the stars were doing their extravagant Texas thing overhead, and after a comfortable silence she said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the wheat field, that you'd wait as long as I needed." "I meant it," he said. "I know, that's partly why." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm not a person who makes decisions quickly about important things. I believe you already know this about me." "I've noticed," he said, with a warmth in his voice that told her this was not a criticism. "But I've been thinking about what I'm actually waiting for," she said. "Whether I'm waiting for grief to disappear, which it doesn't. Whether I'm waiting to stop loving Thomas, which isn't going to happen and also isn't required. Whether I'm waiting to feel certain, which is," she paused. "Which is something I'm not sure is ever available, really. Certainty. Probably not," he agreed. "So I've been thinking about what I actually have," she said, "instead of waiting for things I'm not going to get. And what I have is a person who came to my door in April when I needed help and gave it freely and honestly and stayed and never asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am." She looked at him. "That's not a small thing, Marcus." "No," he said, his voice very quiet. "I'm not over my grief," she said. "I don't think I will be entirely for a long time. But I've decided that I'm also not willing to use grief as a reason to refuse something that is." She paused again, because she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she needed to be precise. "Something that is real and present and good, because I think this is real and present and good. I think you are." He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing with great deliberateness. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was so unguarded that she felt the particular vertigo of being fully seen. "Jennie," he said, "I have been half in love with you since the day you told me you couldn't take charity and we needed to put the arrangement in writing." He paused. "And fully in love with you for some time since then." She had been hoping he would say something like that, and she was still not entirely prepared for how it moved through her when he did. "That's quite an admission," she managed. "It is," he agreed. "I've been rather undone by it, frankly." She laughed, and the laughter felt light and real and clean, and she reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing, and his hand turned immediately under hers so that his fingers were holding hers, and the warmth of his hand in the cool September air was something she filed away as a thing she wanted to feel again regularly. "I think I love you too," she said. "I'm still finding out the exact shape of it, but yes, I think that's what this is." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips against her knuckles, which was such a formal and careful and tender gesture that she felt something in her chest go entirely undone. "Then we'll find out the shape of it together," he said. October came, and with it the ease of two people who had stopped negotiating their feelings and started simply having them. Marcus came for dinner on Saturdays, and she went riding with him on Sunday mornings on the open land between their properties, and the boundary between what was his and what was hers became pleasantly blurred in a way that felt like a natural progression rather than an erasure. They kissed for the first time in the second week of October, in the kitchen doorway as he was leaving after dinner, and it was not the tentative, polite gesture of people who are uncertain of each other. It was direct and warm and entirely real, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the slight roughness there and thought, in the bright, clear moment of it, that she had made the right decision in choosing to want something present over waiting for certainty that wasn't coming. He held her carefully when they parted, like something he was aware of the value of. "I don't want to push you toward anything faster than you're ready for," he said. His hands were on her shoulders, holding her at the careful distance of a man with self-control he was applying consciously. "You're not pushing me," she said. "I told you that I'm not a person who makes decisions quickly. I also told you that I've made the decision." "What is the decision, specifically?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was very careful and very hopeful, and she recognized that he was asking a more specific question than she'd answered yet. She looked at him steadily. "I think you should talk to Pete in the morning," she said. "He's the closest thing I have to family in Texas, and I would like him to hear it from you. And then I think we should go to the Reverend in Caldwell." "If that's what you're asking." His face, in the lamplight from the kitchen doorway, was so nakedly full of something that she felt it like warmth. "That is exactly what I'm asking," he said. He talked to Pete the following morning before she was awake, and when she came out to the kitchen, Pete was at the table with coffee, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had already known everything and was pleased to have it confirmed. "Well," Pete said. "Good." "Don't start," she said. "Been waiting 6 months for someone to start," he said. "All I'm going to do is say good and mean it." She sat down across from him and took his weathered old hands in hers and told him she wasn't going anywhere, that this was still his home as long as he wanted it, and his eyes got a little wet in a way he addressed by looking at the ceiling and clearing his throat considerably. They were married in the Caldwell Church on the first Saturday of November, 1881, with Pete as the witness on Jennie's side and Cord and Esteban on Marcus's, and the Reverend said the words over them in the afternoon light coming through the church windows. And Jennie Slater became Jennie Keller with a feeling that was not the uncomplicated young certainty of her first marriage, but something more complex and deliberate, and perhaps for that reason more fully chosen. She had worn her best dress, the green wool one she'd ordered from the catalog in September, in a moment of quiet, private confidence, and Marcus had seen it when she came down the church steps to meet him, and his expression had made the catalog order entirely worthwhile. He kissed her in front of the Reverend, and Pete and Cord and Esteban, with a thoroughness that drew a politely muffled comment from the Reverend about the ceremony being concluded, and Jennie laughed against his mouth and felt the laugh go all the way through her. The legal business of their marriage was somewhat complicated in the way that the combination of two separately held properties always is, and they worked it out over 2 weeks with the lawyer Hartwell, who also informed them in the same visit that the bank case against Halloran was proceeding well, and that 3 other families had been compensated, and that Halloran's position at the bank was essentially no longer his. This was satisfying in a way that felt clean rather than vindictive, which was the preferable kind of satisfying. They decided to continue to operate both ranches as a single entity under a combined name, Slater Keller being the solution Jennie proposed, because she was not willing to erase either name, and Marcus agreed so immediately that she could tell it was not something he would ever have suggested she erase. The winter of 1881 going into 1882 was milder than the winter before had been, which felt like the universe offering a modest concession. They moved into the Slater house because it was larger and in better repair than Marcus's house, and they brought whatever furniture and equipment from the Keller place was worth bringing, and Pete moved into the larger of the outbuildings that they made habitable, and Cord stayed on as a hand, and Esteban went back to New Mexico where his family was, with a good reference and 3 months' wages in advance that Marcus paid from what turned out to be a more substantial savings account than he had ever mentioned, which he was somewhat embarrassed about when it came out, and she was somewhat exasperated about in the most affectionate possible way. "You had money all along and you let me nearly lose my land," she said. "I offered seed and equipment and labor," he said carefully. The money wasn't the right tool for what the situation required. She thought about this and concluded that he was right, which was irritating and also completely accurate. What the situation had required was not money. What it had required was presence and persistence and partnership, and those were exactly what he had offered. "All right," she said. "But no more hidden resources. Everything is shared now." "Everything is shared," he agreed, and the way he said it suggested he was talking about considerably more than bank accounts. February of 1882 brought a discovery that Jennie had not quite allowed herself to expect, and she sat at the kitchen table in the early morning with a feeling she had not felt in many years, and a complicated mixture of emotions she needed a moment to sort through. Joy, yes, and a specific tender grief that was for the children she had lost before, the miscarriages and the son who had died at 2, a grief that she carried always at a low level, and that this news made briefly acute. And then joy again, real and rising. She told Marcus that evening and watched something move through his face that was so undefended and so overwhelmed that she got up from her chair and went to him, and he put his arms around her and held her for a long time in the kitchen in the lamplight while the winter wind moved around the house outside. "Are you all right?" he asked, against her hair. "Yes," she said, and then, "I've lost children before. I need you to know that. I won't pretend otherwise." His arms tightened. "I know," he said. "We'll be careful. We'll get the doctor from Caldwell to attend you, and you'll rest when you need to, and He stopped. "You'll what?" she said. "I'll be here," he said. "Whatever happens. I'll be here." She pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which was, she had discovered over the preceding months, something she was learning to allow without the old reflexive resistance. Being held by Marcus, she had found, was not the same as surrender. It was something else. It was a specific form of being known. The spring of 1882 was busy in the way that a well-run ranch in growing season always is, and the south pasture went into wheat again with confident expertise born of one season's accumulated knowledge. And the cattle herd had grown over the winter because Marcus had brought 15 head of his own when they consolidated the operations. So they were running 52 head in total on the combined acreage, which was a serious and viable number. Pete's hip was getting worse, and they hired a younger hand named Amos in April, a good-natured man of 26 from Georgia who worked hard and asked sensible questions and fit into the rhythm of the place without friction. Jennie was 4 months along by April and had not had the difficulties she'd had in previous pregnancies, which she was cautiously grateful for without wanting to be too specifically hopeful for fear of somehow jinxing it, which was not a logical position, but which she suspected any woman who had been where she'd been would understand completely. Marcus, for his part, was exercising a self-control around his concern that she found touching. He helped without hovering. He noticed without commenting. He had a gift for this. She'd learned the gift of attentiveness that didn't tip into suffocation, and she loved him for it with a specific directness that still occasionally surprised her with its intensity. She told him once, on a May evening on the porch, that she loved him, and she meant it with her full self, not as a courtesy or a reassurance, but as the simple factual statement of her interior state. He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might not say anything, but then, "I love you," he said, with the deliberate, quiet weight of a man who does not say things like this lightly and means every syllable, "more than I know how to properly express. Though I intend to keep trying." "That's a very satisfying answer," she said. "Good," he said, and took her hand and held it, which was the whole of the gesture and also somehow the whole of everything. The summer of 1882 was dry but not desperately so, and the wheat came in well for the second year running, and the cattle sold at good prices, and the Slater-Keller ranch was, by any reasonable measure, a functioning and increasingly prosperous operation. Their son was born on the 22nd of September, 1882, on a Tuesday morning when the air had the first real autumn coolness in it, and the doctor from Caldwell was present, and Jennie held the experience of the labor with the focused, enduring practicality she brought to everything difficult. and Marcus sat in the hall for 3 hours in a state of barely contained dread that Pete and Amos addressed by providing him with coffee and very little conversation. When the baby cried, Marcus heard it from the hall, and the sound did something to him that he had not prepared for, though you cannot really prepare for that. And when the doctor came to the door and said everything was well, Marcus had to sit with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a minute while Pete patted him on the shoulder with the gentle efficiency of an old man who has seen enough of life to find this entirely understandable. They named the baby Thomas James Keller. Thomas for the man who had broken this land and loved this woman, and deserved to be remembered in the going forward of things, and James for Marcus's father in Ohio. It was Jennie's suggestion and Marcus's immediate acceptance, and neither of them felt the need to talk about it very much because some things are simply correct and require no justification. Pete held the baby on the evening of the birth with the practiced hands of a man who had held babies before, somewhere in a life that predated everything Jennie knew of him, and his face had the expression of a man looking at something very small and entirely important. The first winter with Thomas James was the ordinary triumph of first winters with babies' exhaustion and wonder in equal measure, a recalibration of everything that constituted a normal night, the particular vivid freshness of seeing an ordinary thing like morning light through a window, reflected in the eyes of a person encountering it for the first time. Marcus was, Jennie discovered, a man who was genuinely good with an infant, patient and sure-handed, and deeply serious about the whole enterprise in a way that made her love him with a specific, swelled tenderness she hadn't anticipated. He got up for the middle-of-the-night wakings without complaint. He learned very quickly what each variation of the baby's crying indicated. He talked to Thomas James with the same quality of serious attention he gave to everyone, as though the baby's opinions were worthy of consideration. "He can't talk," Jennie pointed out one evening, finding Marcus having what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with the baby in the rocking chair. "He's listening," Marcus said. "He's 4 months old." 4 months of listening is 4 months of information, Marcus said, and she left him to it because it was, actually, not a wrong argument. By the spring of 1883, Thomas James was sitting up and conducting extensive investigations into the nature of things he could reach, and the Slater-Keller Ranch was entering its 3rd season of combined operation, with the settled confidence of a place that knows what it's doing. Pete's hip had deteriorated enough that he had largely retired from active ranch work and spent his days in the kitchen or on the porch with the baby, which was an arrangement that suited everyone including Pete, who had clearly been looking for an excuse to retire without having to announce it. The Halloran case had concluded in the previous autumn with a judgment against the bank that resulted in penalty fees and new regulatory oversight for lending practices in the county, which didn't undo the harm Halloran had done, but did constitute an acknowledgement that the harm had been real. The 3 families who had lost their land were partially compensated. Halloran himself had left Caldwell County and gone somewhere nobody much tracked. In March of 1883, a letter arrived from the Larson family, who had managed to recover their property and were writing to thank Jennie for her part in the bank case. She read it at the kitchen table with Thomas James on her lap, the baby making sustained and interested commentary on the letter paper, and she felt the particular satisfaction of something difficult and right having been pursued to its conclusion. She wrote back to the Larsons. She wrote about the wheat crop and the cattle and the baby and the general state of the Slater-Keller operation, with the natural warmth of a woman who has found the life she didn't quite know she was working toward. She wrote about Marcus with a care and a directness that she was aware would have surprised the version of herself who had sat in the dirt of her porch in April of 1881, reading a bank letter with her legs gone out beneath her. She had arrived somewhere she hadn't known existed when she'd started out. She was not done arriving, but she was, unmistakably, home. Marcus found her writing at the table and came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the letter, and he put his hands on her shoulders with the easy naturalness of a man who has earned the right to touch his wife with that particular ease, and she leaned back slightly into the warmth of him, while Thomas James made further observations about the letter paper, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay in bright rectangles across the table. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Letter to the Larsons. They got their land back." "I heard," he said. He leaned down and pressed a kiss against the top of her head. "Good news." "Yes," she said. She set down her pen and put one hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, and she felt the solidity of him behind her, the particular, specific, unrepeatable solidity of this particular person, who had come to her gate in April of 1881 and looked down at her in the dirt, and said, "We have 60 days," as though it were the most natural and obvious thing in the world, and then had kept every unspoken promise implicit in that simple "we." Thomas was in the east pasture under the old elm. She went there sometimes in the evenings when the light was long and golden, and she brought flowers from the kitchen garden in season, and she spoke to him in the easy interior way that one speaks to the people one has loved across whatever distance separates the living from the dead. She told him about the ranch, about Thomas James, who had his grandfather's name and his mother's persistence and his father's grave dark eyes. She told him she was happy in a way that didn't diminish what they had had, because she had come to understand that love is not a fixed and finite quantity that runs out when redistributed, but something that has its own enlarging capacity, growing into available space rather than diminishing from division. Marcus knew she went there. He never commented on it and never made her feel that it required explanation. He was the kind of man who understood that a person's interior life has rooms in it that are not accessible to anyone else, and that this is not a failure of intimacy, but simply the honest geography of a self. She loved him for that too. She had a long list. The summer of 1883 was the best they had yet had on the combined ranch. The wheat crop was excellent by any measure. The cattle herd had grown to 64 head. They hired a second hand alongside Amos, a quiet young man named Robert who was 22 and from Tennessee, and turned out to have a particular gift with horses that made him invaluable in ways that had nothing to do with cattle at all. Marcus began to think about expanding the breeding stock, and he and Jennie spent several evenings at the kitchen table going over the numbers for what a modest quarter-horse breeding operation might require and yield. And the conversation was conducted with the particular pleasure of two people who enjoy thinking about the future together. Thomas James learned to walk in August, and the whole household stopped to watch with the unreasonable awe that children's first independent steps seem to command regardless of how biologically expected the event is. He walked from the kitchen table to the kitchen door with the lurching, focused determination of a small person who has decided a thing and intends to do it, and Pete made a noise that was not technically a sob, but was in that vicinity, and Amos laughed with genuine delight, and Marcus crouched at the kitchen door with his arms open, and Thomas James reached him and grabbed his father's hands with a triumphant sound that was both the most ordinary thing in the world and entirely extraordinary. Jennie stood at the kitchen table with her hand pressed against her mouth and felt, in that moment, the full stacked weight of everything she had: the land, the work, the man who had come to her gate, the son she had not expected to have, the old man in the chair and the hands in the pasture and the wheat in the south field and Thomas under the elm, and all of it, a life built from a season of desperation and a neighbor who had refused to let her face it alone. She was grateful in a way that had no adequate language, so she just breathed it in and let it be there. That October, Marcus told her at dinner that his younger sister Elaine was coming to visit from Ohio with her husband, the first of his family she would meet, and Jennie felt the small social nervousness of that prospect and addressed it by cleaning the house very thoroughly over the course of several days in the way that women who are nervous address things they can control. Elaine arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a hired buggy from the Caldwell station, a woman of 32 with Marcus's coloring and a laugh considerably larger than her frame, and she took one look at the ranch and at Jennie and at Thomas James toddling across the yard and said, "Oh, Marcus, finally," with the sisterly candor of a woman who had apparently been waiting for exactly this for some time. Marcus had the expression of a man who is both exasperated and secretly pleased. "Elaine," he said. "I'm just saying," his sister said, picking up Thomas James with the ease of a woman who had children of her own, 2 boys back in Ohio she had shown Jennie photographs of. "I've been telling him for years, Elaine," Marcus said. "You have a lovely home, Jennie," Elaine said, shifting seamlessly to graciousness. "And this child is extraordinary." "He is," Jennie agreed. "He gets it from his father." Elaine looked at her brother. "I like her," she announced. "I'm aware," Marcus said. The visit was a week, and by the end of it, Elaine had communicated to Jennie in the efficient way of sisters-in-law, who have decided to be allies, a great deal of useful information about Marcus, his stubbornness, which Jennie already knew, his specific form of generosity, which she knew better than Elaine did, the fact that he had not come to Elaine's wedding because he had been in the grip of grief for Clara and could not manage it, and had felt terrible about this for years, and the fact that when he had written to Elaine about Jennie in the spring of 1882, he had apparently filled 3 full pages, which was unprecedented in a man whose correspondence was usually measured in single paragraphs. 3 pages, Jennie said. "Front and back," Elaine said with great satisfaction. "He was completely done for and didn't fully know it yet." Jennie looked across the yard to where Marcus was showing Thomas James the horses, the baby on his hip, pointing at each horse in turn with a patient seriousness that the baby was matching with a focus that suggested he had his father's capacity for single-minded attention. "He knew," Jennie said. "He just was being careful with me." "Well," Elaine said. "Yes, that's Marcus." Yes, Jennie thought, that was Marcus, careful and present and absolutely constant. Elaine and her husband left on a Sunday morning with promises to return in the spring, and an invitation extended to Jennie and Marcus and Thomas James to come to Ohio whenever they could manage the distance, which they agreed to consider for the following year. And the house was quieter after they left in the way that houses are quieter after someone vital has been in them and departed. The November of 1883 brought the first real cold of an early winter, and the ranch settled into the quieter rhythms of the cold season, reduced outdoor work, more interior maintenance, the long evenings by the stove that Jennie had come to love without having expected to. She had not known she was a person who enjoyed evenings by the stove with a book and a husband and a toddler who had very decided opinions about bedtime. She was reading one such evening when Marcus looked up from the accounts book he was reviewing and said, with the studied casualness of a man raising a subject he has been thinking about, "I've been thinking about the East Pasture." She looked up. "The East Pasture. Thomas's grave is there," he said. "I want to be sure it's always properly marked and maintained. I was thinking," he paused, "I was thinking we might put in a proper stone marker in the spring. He deserves better than the wood marker that's there." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze with the calm directness that was simply who he was. "Yes," she said. "He does. Thank you for thinking of it." Marcus nodded and returned to his accounts book, and Jennie looked at her book and did not read it for several minutes because she was thinking about the kind of man who understood that honoring what came before was not a threat to what exists now, who extended respect to a woman's past without being made small by it, who could say Thomas's grave and mean it as a simple, caring statement of fact rather than anything complicated or guarded. She reached across and put her hand over his on the accounts book. He turned his hand and held hers without looking up from the page, in the familiar unconscious way of people who have been reaching for each other long enough that it requires no thought. They sat like that by the stove while Thomas James slept in the next room and Pete snored in his outbuilding, and the winter wind argued with the Texas night outside, and the lamp made its warm circle on the kitchen table, and the accounts book showed numbers that were good and growing. By the spring of 1884, Jennie was 3 months along again, which she told Marcus on a Sunday morning in the kitchen with the particular directness that had come to characterize how she delivered important information to him, and his response was first to put his arms around her and hold on, and then to pull back and look at her face very carefully with the specific concern of a man who knew the history. "Are you well?" he asked. "So far," she said. "The doctor thinks it's looking good." "I intend to be sensible." "When have you ever been sensible?" he said, and then quickly, "That's not, I mean, it's perfectly fair," she said, laughing. "I'm going to worry," he said. "I know. I'll allow it within reason." "What's within reason?" "Not excessive hovering, the occasional check-in, and not telling Pete yet because he'll be insufferable about it for months." "I can manage that," he said. He could not entirely manage not hovering, and she decided that within reason included a moderate level of hovering from a man who was operating from both love and the knowledge of her history, and she let it go with more grace than she would have expected from herself on the subject. The second baby was a girl, born in late November of 1884, a Tuesday again because apparently Tuesdays were what this family did, and the doctor again and the 3 hours in the hall for Marcus again. Only this time Thomas James was also in the hall and had very clear opinions about the situation, mostly expressed through repeated escapes from Pete's supervision toward the closed bedroom door. Marcus dealt with the recapture of his son between periods of sitting with his face in his hands, which Amos observed from a respectful distance, with an expression that suggested he was learning a great deal about the future by watching the present. The girl was healthy and loud and decisive from her first moment, which Jennie felt was promising. They named her Clara Rose Keller, and when Jennie told Marcus the name she decided on, she watched something happen in his face that went entirely across the landscape of his feelings in the space of about 3 seconds: grief and love and gratitude, and something she could only identify as a particular healing, and he pressed his forehead against hers and breathed. "You don't have to," he started. "She deserves to be remembered too," Jennie said quietly. "The names we carry are how the dead stay with us. He held her for a long time." Thomas James met his sister with the evaluating skepticism of a 2-year-old who has been the primary person of interest and now has competition, but within a week had assigned himself her official guardian with the solemnity of a person taking on an important position, and would alert the whole household to Clara's smallest indication of distress with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally at 2 in the morning, very much the opposite of convenient. Pete held Clara the way he had held Thomas James, with the weathered old hands and the expression of a man looking at something that matters. His hip was bad enough by the end of 1884 that he rarely went farther than the porch, but his position in the household was undiminished, and his opinions remained in robust circulation. The ranch continued to grow, carefully, because Jennie and Marcus were both people who distrusted expansion for its own sake and preferred stability to ambition. The quarter-horse breeding program they discussed came to fruition in 1884 with 2 breeding mares, and a good stallion purchased from a reputable breeder in the hill country. And by 1885, they had 4 foals and a waiting list of buyers, which Robert managed with the gift he'd always had for horses and a growing expertise that Marcus was quietly working to compensate appropriately. The stone marker for Thomas Slater went in the east pasture in the spring of 1884, a proper limestone marker with his name and dates cut clearly, and Jennie put the first flowers there when the spring blooms came in and stood for a while in the morning light saying the things she always said, and felt that something had been properly, finally, honored. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly or quickly, but with the full presence of a life being lived rather than survived. Thomas James grew into a serious, curious boy who was his father's shadow in the pastures and his mother's in the kitchen when she was working, apparently determined to understand the entire operation from every angle simultaneously. Clara was her brother's near opposite in temperament, loud and sociable and fearless, with a gift for animals that emerged early and clearly and delighted Robert beyond expression. Pete died in the autumn of 1886, quietly in his sleep, which was the right way for a man who had been slowly making his peace with the end of things to go. Jennie sat beside him in the morning when they found him and held his rough old hand and cried with the clean, honest grief of someone who has loved a person long enough to know the full shape of them. Marcus stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder. Thomas James, who was 4, sat in the kitchen and was unusually subdued. Clara, not yet 2, didn't understand but was very quiet. They buried Pete near the east fence, not far from Thomas, because Pete had been part of the Slater land as long as it had been the Slater land, and he belonged there. The spring after Pete died, they hired a housekeeper named Mrs. Elena Vargas, a Mexican widow of 45 who had been keeping house for the Mendoza family until that family's eldest daughter was old enough to take over, and who arrived at the Slater-Keller ranch with the contained efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and expected the same from everyone around her. She and Jennie developed a relationship of mutual respect that operated at a high temperature and contained a great deal of argument and considerably more affection than either of them ever directly acknowledged. In the spring of 1887, Jennie walked the south pasture with Marcus on a morning in April that was exactly 6 years from the morning he had first found her there looking at the possibility of wheat, and she remembered it without saying so, just walking beside him in the morning light with the wheat coming up green again in its 3rd generation of planting, and the whole spread of the Slater-Keller ranch visible in every direction: the barn, the house, the cattle on the north pasture, the horses in the east paddock, Clara on the porch of the house pursuing some investigation, Thomas James following Amos toward the barn. She was 37 years old, and she was where she belonged, and what had nearly been taken from her had grown into something larger and better than what she'd been holding when Halloran's letter arrived. She looked at Marcus beside her in the morning light. He was 42, weathered and capable and calm, and he was looking at the wheat with the same quiet, appreciating attention he gave everything that was growing and good. There were lines at his eyes now that hadn't been there 6 years ago, and his hair was beginning to show gray at the temples, and he was, she thought, looking at him in the clear April light, exactly as beautiful as he had been on the morning he'd crouched in front of her in the dirt and asked how long with those steady gray-blue eyes. "I've been thinking," she said. He looked at her. "Dangerous," he said, with that dry note that still, 6 years on, came at her sideways and made her want to smile. "Don't start," she said. "I've been thinking about Ohio, Elaine's invitation. We've been saying we'll go and we never do. The ranch doesn't exactly run itself. Amos is fully capable. And Robert and Mrs. Vargas would manage the house so thoroughly that it would probably be better organized when we returned than when we left, which I find slightly threatening to contemplate." He considered this. "You want to go to Ohio? I want the children to see where you come from," she said. "I want to see where you come from. I want Thomas James and Clara to know they have family in Ohio and that the world is larger than Caldwell County." She paused. "And I want to see green. The soft kind of green you told me about." He looked at her with an expression that was so simple and so warm that she felt it in her chest. "All right," he said. "We'll go in the fall after harvest." They went in October of 1887. A train journey of considerable duration and considerable entertainment, with 2 children and 1 husband who discovered, after approximately 15 hours on a train, that he had strong opinions about train travel that he had not previously known he possessed. Jennie managed Thomas James and Clara with the firm, cheerful pragmatism she brought to everything, and Marcus managed the luggage and the tickets and the logistics, and they arrived in Ohio in a state of maintained dignity that had required collective effort. Elaine met them at the station with her husband and her own 2 boys in the large laugh, and was immediately Thomas James's favorite person in Ohio based on the quality of her greeting, which involved being swung around by an adult, which Thomas James found authoritative. Ohio was green. The particular, soft, saturated green that Marcus had described, so different from the dry gold and brown Texas palette that Jennie had lived in long enough to think of as the only natural landscape. The trees were turning in October, gold and rust and deep red, and the air had a moisture in it that Texas never quite managed, and Jennie stood outside Elaine's house on the first morning and looked at all of it and understood in a visceral, physical way what Marcus had meant when he said he sometimes still missed it. He came to stand beside her and looked at the October Ohio morning with her. "Green," she said. "Yes," he said. "I can see why you miss it sometimes." "And you understand why I went back to Texas?" "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. She took his hand. He held it. The trees moved in the Ohio morning light, and the children's voices came from inside the house, and it was exactly the right place to be for this particular 10 days. And at the end of it, Texas would be the right place again. And that was the truth of having a home. It is what you come back to from all other beautiful things. They were back in Caldwell County by the end of October, and the ranch received them with the particular eloquence of a working place that doesn't care about sentiment but needs you anyway. And within an hour of arriving, Jennie was in her kitchen and Marcus was in the barn, and both of them were deeply, unreservedly glad to be home. That winter was long but not harsh, and there were evenings by the stove and a new batch of foals in the spring of 1888. And a letter from Elaine announcing that she and her husband were considering coming to Texas for a visit in the summer, because the boys were old enough to find the idea of ranching romantic, which Jennie read aloud to Marcus with the specific pleasure of someone who knows that Elaine's presence always makes things more alive. In the spring of 1888, 3 weeks after Clara turned 3, and Thomas James had his 6th birthday, and they were at the peak of spring planting season with everything happening at once, and the kitchen perpetually smelling of bread because Mrs. Vargas had strong views about bread. Jennie came into the kitchen one afternoon and found Marcus standing at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking at the south pasture. She recognized the quality of the looking. She came and stood beside him and looked at the south pasture too, the wheat coming up green, the distant elm at the east fence, the horses in the paddock. "What are you thinking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That I came here 8 years ago to get away from grief," he said, "and stayed because I couldn't find a reason to leave, and then stayed for a very different reason." He turned to look at her. "I'm glad I stopped at your gate." She looked back at him. 6 years of marriage, and the directness of his looking at her still had the power to make her feel fully seen in a way that was not always comfortable and was always good. "I was sitting in the dirt," she said. "You were holding a bank letter and your legs had given out," he said. "And I looked at you and couldn't keep riding. And that, as it turns out, was the best decision I ever made." She put her hand against his jaw, the way she had in the Caldwell church doorway, feeling the familiar texture of him. "It was also the best thing anyone ever did for me," she said, "and I have never once taken it for granted. I need you to know that." He leaned into her hand very slightly, which was one of those specific small gestures of his that arrived quietly and meant everything. "I know," he said. "The wheat grew in the south pasture. The cattle moved on the north range. The horses ran in the east paddock. The children's voices came from somewhere in the house, Thomas James's serious tones and Clara's louder commentary on whatever was currently demanding her attention. Mrs. Vargas was audible in the kitchen adjacent, conducting affairs with her usual authority. Somewhere far out on the property, Amos and Robert were managing the afternoon work. All of it was exactly what she had fought to save on a Tuesday morning in April of 1881, sitting in the dirt with a bank letter and her legs gone out beneath her. And all of it was immeasurably, specifically, precisely more than she had known she was fighting for. Because she had been fighting for the land, and the land had given her back a life. She took Marcus's hand from the coffee cup and held it, and they stood together at the kitchen window in the spring afternoon light, looking at everything they had built out of one desperate season and a refusal to be alone in it, And the particular fullness of that moment was the kind that doesn't require anything added to it, the kind that is exactly sufficient unto itself. The wheat grew. The sun moved across the Texas sky. Jennie Slater Keller, who had once read a bank letter in the dirt of her porch with shaking hands and something that might have been the end of her world, stood in her kitchen holding her husband's hand and felt the singular, unrepeatable rightness of a life fully and honestly inhabited. Outside, Thomas James came running across the yard with Clara in pursuit, both of them making the particular joyful noise of children who have discovered something interesting and need to show it to someone immediately. Marcus looked down at Jennie. She looked up at him. "Ready?" he said, meaning the children, meaning the afternoon, meaning all of it. "Always," she said, and they went to meet them together in the good Texas light.